Imagine being alone, driving through dark streets in the middle of the night. Everything is calm until, out of the corner of your eye, you notice something strange. A shadow, a movement in the backseat. Your heart races, your breathing quickens, but when you turn around, there's no one there. John thought he was just tired, just another ordinary night at work, until exhaustion turned into fear. The kind of fear that doesn't go away, the kind of fear that sits in the back seat and watches you, waiting for the right moment to appear. You can turn off the lights, but what do you do when the terror is right beside you in the silence of the night? John glanced at the clock on the car's dashboard. It was almost 3 a.m, and he was ready to call it a night. The last ride had taken him to a distant neighborhood, a place far too quiet for his liking. He parked the car and waited for the passenger to get out. The man in the back seat had been silent the entire way, only responding to John's polite questions with monosyllables. Finally, the passenger exited without saying another word, and John sighed in relief. He always felt more nervous during the last rides of the night. The darkness seemed to hide things he'd rather not see. While waiting for the app to end his shift, he glanced at the rearview mirror, almost instinctively, and then he froze. There was someone in the back seat. John blinked rapidly, his heart racing, trying to stay calm. I must be tired, he thought. He turned to look at the back seat, expecting to see only the empty upholstery. But for some reason, his chest tightened, as if he expected to find something or someone. When he finally turned around, there was no one. I knew it. It's just fatigue, he muttered to himself. But even so, the feeling of being watched didn't go away. Determined to ignore it, John started the car and began driving home. The streets were deserted, lit only by flickering streetlights and deep shadows between them. He opened the windows to let in the cool night air, trying to shake off the growing discomfort he couldn't explain. As he drove, he couldn't help but glance at the rearview mirror again. His body acted before his mind, moving his eyes to the mirror, even though he told himself not to do it. And there it was again, the shadow of a figure. His heart pounded. Sweat dripped down his forehead. He abruptly hit the brakes, stopping in the middle of the deserted road, and turned sharply to the back seat. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. John took a deep breath, trying to calm down. You're imagining things. It must be lack of sleep. He refocused on the road, his hands trembling slightly on the steering wheel. John's mind knew there was no one there, but his body refused to accept that. The air in the car felt heavier, as if someone really was sitting back there, watching his every move. When he finally arrived home, he parked in the garage and stayed inside the car for a few moments, breathing slowly. He knew he was letting his imagination run wild. He opened the car door, got out, and walked around to the trunk, ready to grab his backpack. But as he closed the trunk, he glanced at the back seat one last time. His body froze. For a split second, he saw something move in the side mirror. A shadow. Something that shouldn't have been there. Something that disappeared before he could focus on it. John ran inside the house, his heart racing, feeling the cold of the night seeping into his bones. Maybe he was exaggerating, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. He locked the door behind him and leaned against the wood, trying to calm down. It's just exhaustion, that's all. But the image of that vague shadow, reflected in the car's mirror, refused to leave his mind. The next morning, John woke up to the sound of his alarm, feeling the weight of exhaustion in his body. The restless night had left him drained, but he didn't want to dwell on the strange experience from the night before. After quickly getting ready, He headed out to meet his colleagues at the cafe they frequented every morning. It was a sort of ritual for the app drivers, a moment to gather and share stories about unusual rides, eccentric passengers, or simply to complain about the previous night's traffic. "Hey, John, make much money last night?" asked Matt, one of the older drivers, known for always having a story to tell. John shrugged, taking the hot coffee from the waitress's hands. "It was quiet, except for one weird thing," he said hesitantly. Matt raised an eyebrow. "Weird? How so?" John didn't want to seem paranoid, but he needed to vent. So, he briefly explained what had happened the previous night. The passenger he thought he saw in the backseat, the shadows, the feeling of being watched. As he spoke, the other drivers around the table started paying attention, and John realized he had captured their curiosity. "Oh man, you were just tired. It happens to everyone after too many hours of driving at night," said Charlie, a younger driver. John nodded, but before he could respond, Matt interrupted with a mysterious smile. "Wait a minute. Did you say you saw a passenger in the rear-view mirror?" Matt leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "I've heard stories about that. They say there's a spirit that hitches rides with drivers at night, especially in those remote areas. It's a sort of, how should I put it, invisible passenger." Everyone laughed, including John, who couldn't help but chuckle nervously, but inside he felt a chill. There was something in the way Matt said it that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. "Ah, come on, don't start with those ghost stories, Matt." Charlie rolled his eyes. "The last thing we need is to get paranoid while driving." Matt laughed, shrugging. "I'm just saying what I've heard. Some drivers have seen similar things. And who knows, maybe our friend John here had the luck, or misfortune, of crossing paths with that spirit." John tried to brush off the joke and change the subject, but Matt's words lingered in his mind. What if he really had seen something? Not a real passenger, but something else? The idea was ridiculous, of course, but the doubt was already planted. Later that night, John prepared for another shift. He hesitated before getting into the car, but ended up laughing at himself. "Are you really letting these silly stories get to you?" The first rides of the night were normal. Passengers chatted casually, some just stared at their phones, and John drove in silence, focused on the road. But as the night wore on, that familiar feeling of unease began to grow again. He found himself glancing at the rearview mirror more than usual, almost as if he was expecting to see something. Then, during a ride to a more remote part of town, it happened again. He was driving down a deserted road, only the soft sound of the tires on the asphalt and the hum of the engine filling the silence. The passenger in the front seat was asleep, head resting against the window. Everything seemed peaceful until the car's radio turned on by itself, tuning to static. John frowned and tried to turn it off, but the button wouldn't respond. Suddenly, he looked into the rear view mirror. There it was, the figure, just an indistinct shadow, sitting calmly in the back seat. This time, it seemed sharper, as if it were more present in the car than before. John almost lost control of the wheel as he stared at the mirror. "This isn't real. This isn't real." He blinked, and the figure disappeared. John pulled the car over to the side of the road, his heart pounding in his chest. He looked over at the passenger beside him, who was still fast asleep, completely unaware of what had just happened. John took a deep breath, trying to regain his composure. The radio returned to normal, and the car fell silent once again. After dropping off the passenger at their destination, John drove home slowly, avoiding looking at the rearview mirror for the rest of the way. He wasn't sure what was happening, But one thing was clear. This wasn't just fatigue. Something was wrong, and he was starting to realize that he couldn't simply ignore it. In the days that followed, John couldn't shake the feeling that something was following him. He avoided talking about what he'd seen in the car, especially with Emily, his wife. She was already worried about how many hours he was working, and John didn't want to feed her the idea that he was losing grip on reality. But deep down, he knew he wasn't imagining things. The nightly rides continued, but now each one felt loaded with tension. Every time he picked up a passenger, a chill ran down his spine, as if the shadow was always there watching. Even when he didn't look directly into the rearview mirror, there was a weight in the car that he couldn't ignore. One particularly dark night, John picked up a ride to an even more remote area. This time, the passenger was a young woman sitting in the front seat. She was on the phone, laughing and chatting with someone, seemingly oblivious to the strange atmosphere that John felt growing in the car. He tried to focus solely on the road, but every second his eyes were drawn to the mirror almost against his will. That's when he felt it. The air inside the car seemed to change suddenly. The temperature dropped sharply, as if a window had been opened and the cold night air had rushed in. But all the windows were closed. John felt swallowed by a suffocating sense of dread. His heart began to race. His hands gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. He tried to ignore it, to stay calm, but then, once again, he glanced at the rearview mirror. The shadow was there. This time, it was undeniable. The outline of a man, sitting upright in the back seat. The shape seemed more solid than ever, as if it was drawing closer to reality. John tried to keep his eyes on the road, but it was as though he was being pulled to look at the mirror again. His mind spun, and a wave of panic surged through him. "Are you okay?" the woman asked, noticing the shift in his behavior. Her voice broke the heavy silence in the car. John swallowed hard, not knowing what to say. He wanted to tell her what was happening, to scream at her to get out of the car, that something was there, something that shouldn't be. But instead he murmured, "Yeah, everything's fine." He lied, hoping the ride would end soon. The rest of the drive was a blur. John barely remembered how he got to the destination. All he knew was that as soon as the woman got out of the car, he felt an immediate sense of relief, like an invisible pressure had been lifted. But at the same time, there was a disturbing certainty. This wasn't over. Weeks passed, and John became a prisoner of his own mind. He started losing sleep, waking up in the middle of the night with nightmares involving shadows watching him. Emily noticed something was wrong. "You're different," she said one evening, while he sat at the table, staring off into space. "What's going on?" Tonside, he knew he couldn't hide what he was feeling any longer. I don't know what's happening," he began. "Something's wrong. I think I'm seeing things in the car. It feels like someone's there with me, but not really. It's like a shadow, a presence." Emily looked at him with concern, but she tried to stay calm. "Do you think it's because of work? Maybe you just need a break, some rest." "It's not that." John shook his head. "This is different. I can't explain it." She hesitated for a moment, then suggested, "Maybe you should see a doctor. It could be stress or, I don't know, extreme exhaustion." John wanted to believe that he really did. But the shadow, that increasingly intense presence, didn't feel like a product of his imagination. He tried to move forward, thinking that maybe a break could help. But the truth was that he couldn't stop. The bills were piling up, and he needed to keep driving, even though the fear grew with every night. One especially quiet night, John was parked on an empty street, waiting for his next ride. He was staring absent-mindedly at the steering wheel when something caught his attention out of the corner of his eye. It was the rear-view mirror. Without meaning to, his eyes moved to the mirror, and what he saw made his blood turn cold. The shadow was no longer indistinct. He could see clearly now. It was a man with a neutral, cold expression, sitting in the back seat as if waiting for him, with a terrifying patience. John screamed, whipping around to face the back seat. It was empty, but something changed in that moment. From then on, the presence was no longer a distant sensation. It was tangible. He could feel the weight of the shadow with every ride, with every moment he spent in the car. The fear was beginning to consume him. John knew something was about to happen. The weeks of encounters with the shadow had led him to this point. He didn't know what it wanted or why it had chosen him, but he knew somehow that this thing was getting closer to him. The growing fear had become unbearable, but what he didn't know yet was that the worst night was still to come. It was a Wednesday, and rain was pouring heavily over the city. The streets were almost empty, and John's night shift was quieter than usual. He had only picked up a few rides, but each one felt longer than it should have. The weight in the air was almost palpable. He was on the brink of a mental breakdown, but he knew he had to keep going, at least until the end of the month, to pay off his overdue bills. That night, he accepted a ride that took him to an even more remote area than usual. The location was a dimly lit back road, surrounded by fields and a few distant houses. John hesitated before accepting, but he clicked the button on the app and drove there. The passenger was waiting by the roadside, a middle-aged man in a long coat, soaked from the rain. "Good evening," the man said as he entered the car, his voice tired. John mumbled a greeting and began to drive, trying to focus solely on the road, as he had been doing. But something about this ride felt different from the start. The rain pounded against the car, creating a curtain of water that made the world outside seem distant, more isolated. The passenger was silent, staring out the window, and John felt an increasing sense of discomfort. It was as if the air inside the car was becoming denser, heavier. As they drove further away from the city, the feeling that something was terribly wrong began to take over John. He tried to concentrate, to keep his eyes on the road, but the familiar sensation of being watched began to intensify. He knew what was coming next, but this time there was something more. The shadow wasn't just a silent presence in the back seat anymore. It seemed to be advancing, getting closer, as if it were gaining strength. And then it happened. The radio, which had been silent until then, burst into static. The sudden, loud sound made John jump in his seat. He tried to turn it off, but the buttons weren't responding. The static shifted into whispers, indistinct, incoherent voices filled with desperation and pain. John recognized one of them. It was his mother's voice, who had passed away years ago. John, he froze. His body was overtaken by an uncontrollable wave of terror. This couldn't be happening. It couldn't be real. The whispers grew louder, and the voices multiplied, as if several people were trying to speak at once, all from inside the radio. He looked in the rearview mirror and felt his heart stop. The shadowy figure was no longer just sitting in the back seat. It was moving, slowly, very slowly, as if it were climbing over the seat, getting closer. The shadow now had a defined shape, that of a man. And this time, John could see the face, a pale, empty face with eyes that seemed like bottomless pits. "John," his mother's voice whispered again. this time closer. Stopped the car. He slammed on the brakes instinctively, the car skidding on the wet asphalt before coming to a halt in the middle of the road. The passenger beside him looked startled. "What are you doing? Are you crazy?" the man asked, confused. John didn't respond. He couldn't. He was paralyzed by terror. The shadow was now almost touching him. He could feel it, the terrible cold emanating from that presence. The figure in the back seat, now fully visible, extended its hand. John let out a desperate scream, threw open the car door, and stumbled out into the rain. He ran a few steps away from the vehicle, breathing heavily, his mind spinning in a chaos of fear. He turned to look at the car and saw something that took his breath away. The shadowy figure was in the driver's seat, sitting where he should have been. "John." The voice on the radio still whispered, even from a distance. The sound seemed to fill the air around him, as if the voices were coming from everywhere. Desperate, he ran back to the car, trying to open the driver's side door, but it was locked. He rushed to the passenger side, where the man was still sitting, now completely terrified. "Open the door!" John yelled, pounding on the window. The man in the passenger seat hurriedly opened the door, panicking. "I don't know what you're doing, but I'm out of here. This is insane." He ran off into the road, disappearing into the darkness and rain. John climbed into the car, gasping for air, and tried to start the engine. The radio still crackled. The voices still whispered his name. But the figure was gone. Or so he thought. He sped away, trying to get as far from that place as possible. The streetlights blurred by as he drove at high speed along the wet road. But then he noticed something. The rear view mirror. Something was moving in it. The figure was back. No longer a shadow, but something real, tangible. John felt despair flood his body. No matter how much he tried to run, the presence followed him. The radio had gone silent, but the silence was even worse. And in the mirror, the shadow extended its hand toward him, this time with a macabre, empty smile. John screamed again, but the sound was swallowed by the noise of the rain. He knew at that moment that there was no escape. This thing wasn't something he could simply leave behind. It was inside him, inside the car, inside his life. The confrontation wasn't physical. It was something far worse, and he was losing. The next morning, John woke up feeling completely drained, as if the previous night had sapped all his energy. He glanced at Emily beside him, sleeping peacefully, unaware of the horrors he had endured. John got up, determined to change his routine. He knew he couldn't drive at night anymore. That much was clear. He got out of bed, and instead of preparing for another night shift, he made a firm decision. He would only work during the day. Maybe with the sunlight, he could avoid the presence, or at least find some peace of mind. He opened the ride-hailing app and changed his settings to accept daytime rides only, feeling a small sense of relief as he did. It felt like he was finally taking a concrete step to protect himself. In the days that followed, the shift change brought some relief, but the fear lingered. During the day, the rides were less tense. There was no oppressive darkness on deserted roads, and passengers seemed more upbeat, chatting and filling the silence that had unnerved John so much. Still, the feeling of being watched never completely went away. Even with the sun high in the sky, John avoided looking in the rear-view mirror. He now drove with a near-robotic stiffness, always focused on the road ahead, trying not to think about the possibility that, at any moment, the shadow might return. Deep down, he knew that simply switching shifts wouldn't solve the problem. The presence wasn't tied to the night. It was tied to him. One afternoon, while waiting for a passenger, John found himself parked on a quiet street. His eyes were fixed on the steering wheel, lost in thought. The feeling that something was wrong returned, slowly and insidiously, as if it were closing in on him. What if the shadow comes back? What if it's with me forever? Without meaning to, his eyes drifted to the side mirror, and a chill ran down his spine. He didn't see anything concrete, but the reflection of the back seat looked distorted, as if there were a faint shadow cast there. Even in broad daylight, fear took hold of him. John quickly looked away, taking deep breaths. The sun was shining outside. People were walking along the streets. Everything appeared normal. But inside him, anxiety was building. He started avoiding not only the mirrors in the car, but also the ones in his own home. In a moment of desperation, he covered the bathroom mirror and the one in the bedroom with towels, fearing that the shadow might appear in them as well. Emily started noticing his changing behavior. "John, what's going on?" she asked one evening as he moved through the house like a ghost, distant and quiet. "You're acting strange. I thought driving during the day would help." John looked at her, struggling to find the words. He didn't know how to explain what was happening. How could he describe what it was like to be terrorized by a shadow, by something that seemed to always be lurking, but that no one else could see? I thought it would help," he began, hesitating. "But this thing, I think it's with me all the time. It doesn't matter when I drive or where I go. It feels like it's always around, like it's waiting." Emily embraced him, but John felt that not even her touch could ward off the growing dread. He knew he needed to take a break from work, to step away, but he also knew that running away wouldn't solve anything. The shadow, or whatever it was, wasn't tied to his night shifts. It was tied to him, and the fear that it would never end grew stronger with each passing day. The days passed slowly. John tried, with all his strength, to maintain an appearance of normalcy, but inside, he knew he was falling apart. The decision to work only during the day had lessened the direct encounters with the presence, but it hadn't freed him from the constant fear. The shadow didn't disappear. It simply waited. Every ride, every stop at a traffic light, John felt an increasing anxiety, as if something was about to happen. One afternoon, he found himself stuck in traffic downtown. The cars around him crawled forward, and he stared straight ahead, trying not to give in to the temptation to look in the rearview mirror. "If I don't look, nothing will happen," he repeated to himself. The mantra almost calmed his nerves, but it was a fragile piece, shattered by one small mistake. The fleeting glance he couldn't avoid. It lasted only a second, a reflex, but it was enough. In the corner of the rearview mirror, he saw it. The shadow, more dense and defined than ever, was there, sitting in the back seat like a regular passenger. This time, however, it wasn't just a shapeless figure. John saw the face, a pale face with empty eyes, staring directly at him, as if it had patiently waited for this moment. John gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles turning white. Sweat dripped down his forehead, and the air inside the car seemed to thin. He tried to convince himself that he wasn't seeing anything, that it was just his mind playing tricks again. But then the shadow moved. Slowly, the figure extended a hand toward the rearview mirror, as if trying to reach him. Panic gripped John. He looked ahead, trying to focus on the road, but his breathing was erratic, and the noise of the traffic around him seemed distant. He looked around, desperate, searching for an escape, but he was trapped. There was no way out. And then, in the midst of the chaos of traffic, The car radio turned on by itself. The static was familiar, but this time, something more happened. The voices he had heard weeks before started whispering again, but now they were louder, more urgent. Among them, the same voice that had tormented him on that rainy night, his mother's voice. "John, you can't run," the voice whispered with eerie clarity. "You can't leave me." John swallowed hard, feeling the weight of something invisible pressing against his chest. He was trapped. There was no escaping this thing, this presence. It wasn't just lurking anymore. It was surrounding him, suffocating him with an overwhelming sense of despair. "John!" The voices kept whispering his name, echoing in the car's cabin. He looked at the rearview mirror once more, and this time the shadow smiled at him, a hollow, inhuman smile, as if it knew he was completely defeated. Desperate, John tried to turn off the radio, but the buttons didn't respond. Panic consumed him entirely. He needed to get out of the car. The suffocating sensation was unbearable, and the face in the mirror seemed to draw closer with every second. With a scream of pure desperation, he swerved the car onto the shoulder and bolted out, stumbling onto the ground as he tried to put as much distance between himself and the vehicle as possible. The people in the cars around him stared in shock, but he didn't care. All that mattered was getting away from that thing that had been following him for weeks. He turned and looked back at the car, expecting to see the shadow there, expecting it to move within the vehicle as it had before. But to his horror, the back seat was empty. Yet, the radio was still on, the voices still whispering his name, as if they were trying to reach him, calling him back. John staggered backward, completely terrified. He knew this wouldn't end. The cycle was far from over. It didn't matter where he went or what he did. That thing was attached to him. There was no escape. Finally, exhausted, he began to walk home. He didn't know what he would do next. Maybe he would try to stop driving completely. Maybe he'd abandon the car and never use it again. But deep down, he knew none of that would make a difference. The fear was already rooted deep in his mind, in his life. The shadow no longer needed a car or mirrors. It was inside him now, always lurking. On a quiet night, another rideshare driver, Sam, went out for another night shift. He parked on a calm street, waiting for a new passenger. Suddenly, a ride request popped up. Sam accepted and drove to the pickup location. As he waited for the passenger to get in, he casually glanced at the rearview mirror, and there, for a split second, he saw a shadow, an indistinct outline in the back seat, something that made his stomach churn with fear. He blinked, and the shadow was gone. With a nervous laugh, Sam muttered to himself, "I need more sleep." But deep down, he knew he had seen something that might never go away.